people of African descent, are commissioned and called to be ambassadors of reconciliation. We're called to create opportunities and space for courage building, healing, fellowship, and empowerment. This special calling is both a reminder and a challenge to ourselves and to the whole church that we are no longer destined to just obey and suffer and witness, but to disrupt, heal, and lead. So Black Anglicans of Canada, we are very new and still kind of in our early formation stage. We have crafted a vision and mission statement. And so please take just a few moments just to read it, just to get a sense of who we are and what our vision and our mission is. We also have crafted some 4 goals around belongingness, empowerment, participation, and representation. And again, please read and inwardly digest it. Our leadership team, we are, we are a group of folks who are leading this work. Myself and Lance Wilson is the co-chair, and we have a number of other folks who are involved as part of our leadership team. And so at this time, I am going to graciously hand it over to Andre Lynn, who will be our moderator for the evening. And so, Mr. Lynn, please come on down.
Thank you, Reverend Jacqueline, and good evening to everybody who's on. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carl James as our presenter for this evening. I have known Carl for possibly 19 or 20 years. Carl holds the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community and Diaspora in the Faculty of Education at York University, where he's also currently the university's Affirmative Action, Equity and Inclusive Officer. He holds cross appointments in the graduate programs in sociology, social and political thought, and social work. Dr. James teaches, researches, and writes about the ways in which institutional policies, programs, practices shape the schooling and educational participation, performance, and achievement of racialized and marginalized people, particularly Black youth. Hence, their employment opportunities, workplace ranking, lived experiences, and social outcomes are part of the work that Carl focuses on. In addition, Carl has done a lot of work around anti-Black racism in educational institutions, school boards, in particular, Peel District School Board, Durham Region, and Ottawa Carleton. Carl, we're really happy to have you, and we hope that, in your presentation, you will share some of the learnings that you've had from working in large institutions and in educational institutions that we can apply to church organizations such as the Anglican Church. How do we move from awareness and acknowledgement of Black racism, anti-Black racism, to action? Dr. James, over to you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much for having me and for inviting me to be part of this. And of course, I pay attention to the fact that we are having this discussion at a time when anti-Black racism, systemic racism, is being talked about and being discussed. And of course, I think it's very significant that the church also feels that it's its responsibility to also pay attention to this discussion, and very, very importantly so. It's also the International Decade of African peoples. And I think that also is important to give attention to us, because it means that we need to constantly think of this decade and what has happened to us. And therefore we need to constantly pay attention to how are Black people being incorporated into the work of the institutions, and how much and effectively are they being served by these institutions. So it's very significant that we pay attention to this. I'm also very, very keen on this discussion, because it reminds me that the church for African peoples and many of us from the Caribbean, the church is a very significant symbol in our lives. And therefore, we cannot talk about anti-Black racism and not think about how the church might be implicated in this, and how we might want to work with the church to change things. Or the church also, on the other hand, what about the leaders of the church paying attention to what needs to be done and so forth? I was very struck by the letter that was sent out by Bishop Asbel, and he made a number of points in that I want to pick up on that I think are very significant for us to think about. One of the points that he made later in the letter, it was, we need to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. It means being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So I see this as giving me the nod that I can raise uncomfortable issues, because members who have been coming here and talking over the past few weeks about anti-Black racism, even the naming of anti-Black racism, are becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable. So I know, and as the letter says, change is hard and it's difficult for some people, but of course it must happen. And I think often when I think of the killing of George Floyd, that's referenced in the letter, and what that sparked for us, and the symbolism of that. And I think we need to think of the symbol of George Floyd lying there with a police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck and having his hand in his pocket. That's very symbolic. And the metaphor is how much the institutions have had their knees on the people, on racialized people's neck, in this case, Black people. And therefore, when we think of it, we're thinking of how do we move, and how does the church, how do institutions start thinking about, how do we start removing that knee? How do we start paying attention to the fact that certain people cannot breathe in our space because of the knee being there? And therefore, I want us to draw attention to that symbol and the symbolism of that. So I agree with the letter and the point that I'm quoting Angela Davis when it says, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change, I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And so I'm thinking that there's a need for change and there's an acceptance to work toward that change. So I very much appreciate the letter. It identifies and highlights a significant number of things that I think is important for us to pay attention to. And in thinking about it, I think about it's not just racism, it's not just what people's attitudes towards each other or what somebody did, but I want us to pay attention to the idea of systemic racism. And systemic racism, I would suggest, is it's not just these individual attitudes, but it's about looking at how individuals, racism among individuals, and how racism cultivated among individuals, looking at the institutional racism as evidenced through the policies, practices, programs of these institutions. And we have to think of how the church also become part of that and how racism operates within the church. And then we can think about structural racism, or I call societal racism, which is the laws, the practices of the state, and how they inherent within them are inequities. And those inequities do not work for some people, including Black. So altogether, I call this systemic racism. That means the interlocking relationship between the individual, the institution, and the structural racism that we experience there. And therefore, these are constant. And these various racism, as operate in a system and together, function and to maintain the system as is. Later on, I'll talk to you to tell you about what I see some students, what I heard from some students today talking about racism. So we have to come to terms with how racism operates and therefore understand its inherent nature. But racism is not something that just started today. And I know many of us have talked about unconscious bias or these things, but we have to think about what's the systemic nature of racism and how, and since our discussion here today is about the church, where's racism within the church? How did it get in the church? Is it part of the church? Is it part of the church's history? And how is that the case? And I want to start off with, when I point in that direction, I want to start off with a video showing the basis of racism within the church and the Anglican church in this case, and what we must come to terms with as we unpack the institutional racism that we need to grapple with and how we're going to grapple with. I'm hoping that we can get into discussion tonight about how we're going to grapple with this history that the church has inherited and how the church is working to address that historical racism. Andre, could you play that video, please?
Yes.
Now, several major British institutions and companies have apologized for their involvement with slavery. The Church of England says its links to the slave trade in the 18th and 19th century were a source of shame. New analysis by University College London found nearly 100 clergymen benefited. 10 former governors and directors of the Bank of England have also been named in that report. The bank called the trade an unacceptable part of British history and vowed not to display images of the senior figures involved. Insurance giant Lloyd's of London and pub chain Green King also made similar pledges. The firms say they'll fund projects to provide opportunities for minorities. But a regional alliance of Caribbean countries says apologies are not enough. It's calling on British institutions, as well as other former colonial powers, to pay for development in the Caribbean. Well, now let's bring in Hilary Beckles from Kingston in Jamaica. He's the chairman of the Caribbean Community Reparations Commission. So Beckles, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me start by asking you how you feel about this apology.
Well, first of all, I would say that this is a process that has been evolving gradually, but is now gaining momentum in this 21st century, which we had, in a sense, predicted it would, given the logic within the world in respect to how to treat historical crimes, slavery through to this 21st century moment. So, in a sense, it is really consistent with an evolving sense of consciousness about the crimes that were committed in the era of colonial empire building.
I know that you've been pushing for reparations. Talk me through the kinds of reparations you'd like to see and how you think they could realistically be rolled out.
Well, again, let us historicize for just a moment. These crimes that were committed, slavery, native genocide, the globalization of African slavery, all of these were processes that helped to build the modern Western world. The entire Atlantic industrial culture on both sides, the American side, the European side, built upon these crimes. And it took all of the 19th century to uproot chattel slavery in the Western world. It took 100 years, legislation, country by country, to eradicate slavery. Then it took us all of the 20th century to bring civil rights and human rights and legislation to the Black people across the Atlantic world. Another 100 years to get those human rights and civil rights recognized. And now we're faced with the 21st century, and the inescapable, inexorable logic in all of this is that this is the moment of reparatory justice for the victims and their descendants. So this is the time, and this 21st century is going to be the century of reparations. In fact, it is quite clear that already it is shaping up to establish that reparatory justice for all of these crimes that have been committed will be the greatest political movement of the 21st century.
Sure.
What we're looking for is development. We're looking for development. We're saying that all of the damage that has been done to the African peoples and their descendants, the empires have collapsed and have left them in poverty, have left them in destitution. Across the Caribbean, what we see is the legacy of European colonization, the poverty, the slum existence, the public ill health, very poor infrastructure. The European countries, having extracted wealth through the slavery, using the Caribbean as a core, have walked away and have left the region in dire straits. So what reparations is calling for is a development model, a strategy that says you must come back to the site of the crimes and you must assist the citizens and their governments in cleaning up the mess that you have left behind that continues to debilitate and harm the descendants of these societies.
Well, this all clearly goes beyond apologies and beyond money, but is about trying to build racial cohesion in the societies that we live in now. What would you say to those arguing that holding on to historical grievances really can create more division today?
The consequences and the legacies of slavery and colonization are debilitating all around us in these societies that were built upon this foundation. You made reference, for example, to the Bank of England. The Bank of England was established in 1694 to regulate all of the cash that was flowing into Britain as a result of the slave trade. And it was thought necessary to coordinate a national banking system. This was put in place because of the tremendous wealth from the slave trade that was poured into the country. Church of England participated in all of this. I am from the island of Barbados, and I grew up in the neighborhood not very far away from the Codrington plantations. The Codrington plantations were owned by the Church of England. Hundreds of slaves were owned by the Church of England. The slaves were branded on their shoulder with the letters C of E, Church of England. And the Church of England was one of the major owners of enslaved peoples, and the profits out of the plantations and the slave plantations owned by the Church of England, those profits were sent back to the bishops of London, and they used that cash to build churches, provincial churches all over England. Then, of course, Lloyd's of London. Slavery and the slave trade could not have continued for 200 to 300 years without a very sophisticated banking system, a sophisticated system of insurance. It could not have gone on without Lloyd's of London. They were the financial brains and the financial infrastructure that enabled all of this to happen, and they did very well financially. So these institutions, they do need to come back to the site of their enrichment and participate in the legacy. This is not unreasonable. This is moral, this is just, and this is the kind of standard management thinking that one would expect in this 21st century. To issue statements of regret and apology from a distance as a public relations exercise, as an exercise in public spectacles, unacceptable and absolutely rejected by the people in the Caribbean. What we're asking for is dialogue, negotiation, and the participation in a system of economic development that will help these societies to move forward.
Hilary Beckles there, the chairman of the Caribbean Community Reparations Commission. Thank you for joining us, sir, on Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much. I think there's much to be said and much in that video, but we'll get to some of that discussion. But some important points that he made. It moves beyond apology, and he's asking for reparations. So when I got the invitation from Andre to do this, I started thinking the role of the church and what might be a productive engagement for this afternoon or this evening. And I thought about, yeah, I remember that video and I said, oh, here it is, an opportunity to engage in this. And I would, one of the important points I think is we just can't talk about one institution. What we're hearing here and what we're seeing is all these institutions are linked. And therefore, reparation must come from all these institutions. And so what is reparations, you might ask? How might we start doing so? And I think we're at this time and space right now of trying to think about what's happening with people, Black people and Indigenous people in the Canadian context right now. I think everyone must engage in this discussion. You know, today, anticipating coming here this evening to talk, I asked some young people who are in grade 10 and grade 11, and we were working with them, and we was asking them, what do you think about now? What do you think about what's going on, the protests, and how do you feel? Do you feel we're getting anywhere? Do you think the churches, schools, and workplaces are really listening and making changes that it's necessary for your lives? Do you think your lives will be better in years to come? Or do you think we as adults have done enough to bring about the changes that you need as young people to be able to live the kinds of lives you want? And they shared with me a number of things, and I want to quote some of them for us to think about. One said, oh, we have come some ways, but no, it's not enough. Learning about our oppression and what we have contributed to society needs to be taught. It should be mandatory. We learn about white men's wars and accomplishment, but what about ours? We need equity in schools, in the workplace, in churches. We need music artists to use their platform to tell about our situation. Another one said, I feel something big needs to happen before things actually begin to change. And this is significant for me. This student is saying it's not, protest is not going to do it. Because this nice person, he said it has to be something big. It has to be a real aggressive kind of action that must be taken, because they're seeing that over the years they have tried doing things over and over again and nothing has happened, and so the situation remains the same. The face of racism changes over time, and it changes in a way that protects the status quo, and therefore the status quo continues, was what another one says. Another one says, I feel like they break the black man mentally, and that's why we didn't fight them. But now some of us are starting to wake up and see reality, and we have rights as human beings, and these are the rights we must work at. Another one said, there's just so much to be angry about in this world. And here we are in 2020, still getting angry over the wrong things that people are doing to us. Another one said, I feel like the younger generation are more optimistic than the older generation. And one said, I am hopeful actually. It won't be easy, but I just know it's something that must happen and change. And we must find a way out of this oppression. So young people are giving us their language, they're telling us what they expect, and they're expecting change to happen. They expect this change must take place among all institutions because they need to be involved in it. And as Becker said, it's not just apology, it's real change that must happen. It must be as we constantly get back to the metaphor, is remember that that knee on the black man's neck that metaphor that we need to grapple with or come to terms with. So the church has a role to play. You know, the church has a role to play insofar as I think of the people who minister to the respective congregations. And, you know, I always think about who these ministers are. You know, do they represent the diversity of the Canadian population? And do they represent the young people that need to have some of the leadership from the church? And I think that's important to think about the ways that the church is going to move forward. And will the church, and the Anglican Church in this case, will the Anglican Church take leadership in moving us beyond just conversation about the situation of Black people, and help to work with government to bring about real change so that we can see things happening among us? And I think there's a role to play for everyone. And by the way, I always think about, we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I always think about, often we always think, yes, we're going to, and because I work in education, we always talk about having educators who represent the student population and have Black teachers to teach Black students. And I would say that for the church, but I also would go further. Because one of the things that this time is reminding us is how stereotypes remain, and how the struggles, as these Black students were saying to us, about the struggle that they have in being respected. And I think if the larger society do not see Black priests ministering to them, then the idea of what the media represents of Black people might never change in the larger population's thinking. And therefore the church has a role to play in moving that forward, so that we have priests who can minister to entirely white population, and also bring other peoples into that congregation. So there's work to be done. And if we're moving, and if we're going forward to change the discourse around race and racism, especially the space of Black people within the church, then the church has a big role to play in this regard. And probably this group of Black Anglicans might take some real leadership in the church. I'm talking the whole church, and not just among yourselves, in order to move further along from where we are. And also thinking in that same process, think about the role of the church. You know, I always wonder, and we did see the video about Barbados, about the Caribbean, and that's what Professor Beckers would talk about. But do you ever wonder, what was the church's role, the Anglican Church's role in Canada with slavery? Do you ever wonder about the Anglican Church's role with Indigenous people and how that's being addressed? I think we need to have those conversations now, especially if we're going to move forward in addressing anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and look at what's happening to racialized people in Canadian society. You have further questions for me, Andre, I think.
Yes, thank you very much, Carl. And I think I'm looking at in the chat, and a lot of people are putting forward questions. And you've begun to answer some of those things. How do we move from, awareness and acknowledgement of this, move beyond apology to what you call the removal of the knee from the necks of people, and we're talking particularly within the Anglican Church. How do we really pay attention to addressing systemic racism and very specifically anti-Black racism? So I'm gonna go to some of the questions in the chat. They're moving fast and furious, and hopefully you can give us some very succinct answers so that we can get to as many of them as possible. And so one of the questions that I see here is, and you've begun to answer it, but you may want to use the opportunity to elaborate on some of the things you have said in your presentation. But how do we dismantle and disrupt issues related to systemic racism in our institutions, involving people who are defiant with a preconceived mindset against anti-Black racism. So knowing that there is, you know, people who recognize that it happens, but are not willing to change. What are some of the things we can begin?
And I think one of the things of what happens there sometimes is we think of it only at the individual level. It's like an attitude towards each other, or somebody not doing something for each other, or having the attitude. But remember, we say this, we talk about this as an ideology. We talk about it being systemic. Therefore, I think we have to be ready. And again, I get back to the bishop's letter that reminds us that we have to be uncomfortable, and we must be ready to listen. We must be able to hear, and we must be ready to invite people who are part of the group that we're trying to address. We have to invite them into the conversation. We just can't make plans for people without them being present at the table. The Black North was established the other day, and it was talking about having all Canadian institutions pay attention to how many Black people they have, both in their businesses and so forth, and their institutions. I would assume the same thing would apply to the church in every possible way. And of course, I always think the church should always take leadership on these moral things, and must address the past, and think of how historically we have learned to maintain the status quo, and how we have to address that.
Another question that we have relates to, so we have the church, but it's not only the church as an institution. We have educational institutions that are associated with the church. And how do we then extend the work that we're doing within the church into those institutions?
Very, very important, because when we think of education institution, but even going to church, we have young people being in the church from kindergarten all the way, and they're going to church. And the education institution has a curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. And those curriculum are, of course, very much structured by the provincial guidelines of curriculum. But sometimes the church has to go beyond that, or sometimes advocate for much more inclusive education, must advocate for more inclusive education, must be willing and ready to push the agenda of equity. And I say equity as opposed to equality. And I say equality meaning treating people differently, but equality means treating people the same, and equity means treating people differently based on their needs, interests, and aspirations. So what the church wants to do is to move towards an equitable stance, treating people and paying attention to race. You know, I would love to ask the church and ministers, how many Black priests exist in the church, and do they keep data? Do they keep, and what about the congregation? Do they know about the population of the congregation and who they are? So I always say, how can you minister to a group of people without paying attention to who they are? And who they are, you pay attention to whether they're indigenous, whether they're Black, South Asian, whether they have disability, etc. You have to pay attention to, because only then are you addressing the whole person. The whole person you want to include into the congregation. And I think that that's important when we think of moving beyond just simply saying, yes, we're going to recognize that we have a diverse population, but know the diverse population. And yes, doing the same thing when we're talking about education.
Yes, and you've raised a very important, or several important questions around who make up the church in terms of, you know, who sit in the pews, who are the clergy, etc. And, you know, I co-chair a committee, intercultural ministry, and those are some of the questions that we're asking of the church. So, you know, we're beginning to peel away at some of those things so we can answer those questions and to develop strategies to address some of those systemic issues. We have quite a few questions that I think, you know, if we could have some of our church leaders may want to respond to some of those, because I'm not sure that from where you sit, Carl, that you can answer them. You know, questions around, and you've asked that, how many racialized Black priests do we have? Questions around, you know, what is the plan and strategy to educate children and young people in the church about racism and race and anti-Black racism?
And we can also talk about the music in the church too. How much is the music reflective of the diversity of the Canadian population and the people? And I also think, when I think here, I think of how many Caribbean people are Anglicans and look for community being part of the Anglican Church, which is very, very significant and important. And we want to keep that community. Now, how much are they being catered to and responded to culturally in a way that keeps them connected to the church and let them feel satisfied after an hour or two being in fellowship, so to speak.
Yeah, we also have a question here, Carl. Do you think if the church created a program discussing racialized history in Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada, such as the church's experience with Black Canadians, Indigenous people, and rolled it out as a course for every parish to participate in, would that be helpful, or something like that?
If it would be helpful, what? Sorry?
If they developed a program that discussed racialized history in Canada and in the Anglican Church.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, I think when I think of the rituals of the church and I've been part of, like confirmation, baptism, marriages and so forth, where discussions are held, people go to the priest and the priests are doing these kind of things. I think obviously those are, the priests should also pay attention to some of those cultural things. And yes, I always think that if we're going to be responsive to the people, if we're going to be responsive to community, a program that talks to the experiences of the community generally, and in this case, Black people, should be there. And I also feel seriously, strongly though, that it's not just simply somebody going away and because they are the head of the church, developing that program, developing what is to be taught. I think that has to be done with the people who we're trying to speak to, making a contribution of what that course should be, or what is important in that course. So yes, I think it's important, but also it has to be done in consultation with those that have a lived experience making that contribution to it.
I think there was a question about reparations and wanting to understand the terminology a bit more. Can you take a minute or two to address reparations, and how would that look from the point of view of, for example, the church?
Oh, you know, if we go back to the video and we see that the church had slaves, the church economics was built on slave labor, the churches in England, and I'm quite sure in Canada were supported by slavery, etc., etc. Therefore, when governments and all these institutions are being asked, especially those who thrived on slave income, when they're given out, the church also must share and must also take up its side of the bargain, because what the church is today is what racialized people, or Black people in this case, and indigenous people might have contributed to it. So how do we respond to it? In many ways. We can respond to it in educational ways. We could respond to it in terms of paying attention to the needs, as been said, as Becky's talking about, looking at the health, looking at the ill health, looking at the poverty situation, all those kind of things. And remember, Black people find the church and God a very serious and important part of our lives. And therefore, it is through that the Black people have found comfort. Now, what are we, what the church as a physical space right now, what's it doing in order to help them and to respond to them? And I think that's what reparations would be. I don't know, and I would not offer, this is what should be, but I think it has to be something that should be considered, and it should be something that everyone should talk about.
And, in some other conversations we've been having, we're hearing talk about, having discussion about the image that we commonly see Jesus being portrayed as. How do we begin to have some of those conversations within our churches around, the image of God and what that means to people who are sitting in the pew, who are, whose view of the image of God is different from what is being portrayed in some of the literature that we have and some of the paintings, etc., that we have around our churches.
What that says to me now then is, it's the church, and this is theology, and I think we just can't talk about the church and the current priests, etc. only. We have to talk about what's going on in the theological step, in the seminaries, where people are learning and understanding and exploring all these kind of things. So the church then should reach into the seminaries. The seminaries should be doing their work right now too, we're looking at the curriculum that they're presenting to priests and how they are preparing priests for the kinds of a diverse global world and congregations that they're going to work with. And that's something that I think should be always ongoing.
In your presentation, Carl, you made note, and please keep the questions coming. I will read them if you send them. Talking about taking leadership. So yes, within our church as the Anglican Church, but you're talking about working with government and engaging government to make changes. We can influence, so we can be influencers. Any kind of suggestions as to how we can do some of this?
Again, I'm going to be sound like I think you can do some of it, but I also feel it's the church recognizing that it must do these things, and the leadership of the church should be calling people together and say, okay, how do we work together? I want to think that the Black Anglicans are not just simply one group. I would assume that they are within the leadership of the church and within the every aspect of the church, that there are going to be Black people who are informing and helping the church to think through all these things, or else the church is not being responsive. And so I would want to think that that can happen.
Okay.
I like one of the questions that I see here. I think from a friend. It says, "Hi, Anglican is a term used worldwide, and it's the singing in Latin, the preference for certain hymns and chants, etc., etc. And must be careful. I always remember a few years ago, probably it was last year or so. I went to, I was in Jamaica, and therefore, and then I was in one church, and I was talking to a colleague who attends another church, and I said, I went to, these are both Anglican church, but they were quite different. One of them would be considered the High Anglican, and the other one would be considered not the High Anglican. Whatever people preference might be, I think it should always be in relation to the needs, interests of the congregation. And, you know, singing, the organ music, all these kind of things should be everything that should be paid attention to if you're paying attention to the congregations that we're working with.
Yeah, and in your presentation, you know, and this I think is directed to our leaders, to ask people to participate, invite people in to participate. We have at least one question here that says, you know, as a minority theological student in the 1980s, the seminary encouraged me to share my indigenous ways in relation to the church. Yet the larger church, the white church, was not interested in hearing about it. How might that change today? You know, so if you even try to share, but you're not being accepted or invited or recognized, how do you, you know, continue to push and to insert yourself?
There's a question that you know, if you're pushing and you're not getting any response, then you might question the church. And I think sometimes churches have to constantly, just as schools, have to also be paying attention to its relevancy. And therefore, if it's going to remain relevant, it must constantly be making observations of its current situation, the people with whom it's interacting, and so forth. So that's very significant. There's one thing that builds on a question that I chat point that I like based on that. She says, talks about the movement in Canada, US right now about the tragic death of George Floyd, and it says, it's discouraging as a white woman who challenges the priest to take a stand and challenge the parishioners. And I keep thinking that one of the things here is not only that racialized people, indigenous or Black people who need to raise these issues, it's going to be other members of the congregation. And this is a very important point. It should not be just the racialized people and the racialized priest raising these questions of making itself responsive to the situation and needs of Black people.
Yeah, I'm just going to read one statement that was made. It's from the Primate's office. It says that the Council of General Synod is being asked at its meeting on July 25th to authorize a new mandate for a dismantling racism task force to assist the General Synod in deepening this work on addressing racism in our midst. So, you know, in case people are not checking the chat, I think that's an important, that's important for people to know about that, what the Council of General Synod is hoping to do on July 25th. So, you know, that speaks to some of the questions that are being asked. How are we going to do this? What are the plans? Funding has been raised. So, you know, there are those things.
So here's another question. Will our church, you know, because I know Black people constantly ask the question, when will governments, especially Western government, apologize for the role in slavery, and when will they respond according to reparation? And then it's a question: will the church
and government
apologize and recognize its role in slavery, and do something about that? Is an important question here too.
Yes. Are there other questions? Would anyone like to, in our leadership, respond to anything that that has been said or posted in terms of the chat box? I think for this group, the Black Anglicans, there've been questions saying, how can you promote yourself so that other people know of your work and what you're doing? So I leave that with the Black Anglicans for them to.
Would you like to attempt to respond to that question?
What's the question?
About what could be done to promote the Black Anglicans more across Canada?
Oh, I would say, what's lovely about the church is that it's not only local, it's regional, and it's national. I think the church should facilitate a network of Anglicans and Black Anglicans in particular, and should, in facilitating that, should also start thinking, how are we going to address and work at racism within the church? Because, I don't think our discussion this evening is trying to say the church is pointing to the church and pointing racism in the church. I think what we're saying here, if racism is inherent in our society, then all the institutions, by extension, are going to have racism as part and parcel of how it has been operated. So it's part of the culture. We established that to be the case. And if it's part of the culture, we're going to be having to actively work against it. It's just like having to actively work against sexism, because we cannot say that we, as males, we cannot say that we have overcome these things. There's something that, because if it's inherent in the society, something that we're going to have to be always challenging. The same thing could be said of homophobia and all those other kinds of factors. Therefore, there's work to be done, and hopefully we'll get there with the church taking a leadership role in these things. And it's not just the Anglican Church, it has to be connected. The Anglican Church can be ecumenical here, taking ecumenical leadership in going forward on these issues.
I think I got the cue that I need to wrap up now. Carl, thank you very much for your presentation, but mainly for the conversation that we've been having. It has been great, lots of chat, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to keep that information so that we can then follow up with our leadership on some of those things.
Yeah, but there's one quick point that that came up in the chat, which I also saw somebody saying there were a poor white person, and therefore you can see how poverty might be a factor. So we're going to have to say, we're going to have to also think about race and class, or race and poverty might operate. But that's for a large discussion, but it's something to acknowledge when we're working on racism.
Yes, we have to acknowledge intersections. Carl, thank you so much, and hopefully this is not the last time we will be having these conversations with you and with all the people that have been here on the chat. It's been great. I'm seeing almost 150 people. This is wonderful. So thank you very much, and I hand it back over to Reverend Jacqueline.
And again, thanks everyone for joining us. Our mandate is to disrupt, heal, and lead, and I think we're well on our way. And our conversation continues next week on Wednesday, July the 29th, with our very own, the Reverend Dr. Sonia Hines, Bending the Knee and Changing the Heart, the Toronto model for a just intercultural church. And I invite you to join us again as we journey together to transform and to change the orbit that we have been planted in. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week. I would like to acknowledge all of our bishops who are present here today. We're reigning bishops. I know I saw Bishop Andrew, Bishop Robinson, Bishop Priscilla, Bishop Fenty. And so thank you for taking time from your extremely busy lives to journey with us. We appreciate your presence. Also like to recognize the primate's office. I don't know whether or not it's the actual primate or just someone from the office, but welcome. It's wonderful to have you. I know that their Dean Chris Britton is present, the Dean of Trinity College. And again, we appreciate you being here because we need all those folks who are decision makers and the ones who hold the key to change to be present with us.